Good morning.
Good morning.
I really hate to interrupt productive conversations, and I'm sure there are lots of them going on, but I think we need to get on with the show. We've had one heck of a party here for a week. It's been one of the most magnificent occasions that I've ever seen in terms of the celebration of one of the great people of Claremont, of California, of the world, Peter Drucker. I wanted this morning just to say again how glad we are here at Claremont Graduate School that you've come to these events. I hope you have benefited from them as much as I have. Ira asked me to just say a couple of words about the importance of Peter Drucker to Claremont Graduate University. And I will do this quickly, not because I think it's minimal, but because if I did it fully, then poor John Collins wouldn't have any time to speak. And that's the man you came to hear. But let me just say there are two ways that I see an enormous influence that Peter has had on this university. The first one is his influence, his imprint on the school that has his name. Some of you know that the faculty put together a book called The Drucker Difference. And in the essays in the Drucker Difference, you have actual lessons about what the Drucker Difference means in the context of the Drucker Ethos School. One of those is that the basic values in leadership from Peter's point of view are adherence to clear moral principles. That is, absolutely no deviation from those principles, and that means that character is probably the most important of all the virtues. I mean, all of the characteristics. The character is terribly important in leadership, and that's because the biggest problem with leadership is always trust. Prime Minister Gordon Brown at the Davos conference last January and February was on a panel at the end of the conference, and it was a marvelous panel. And he gave a summary statement that went something like this. He said, "We will not solve this financial crisis until we understand that the problem is not the loss of credit or the paralyzed credit institutions, the absence of credit." He said, "It's another word that comes from the same root, credo, which means trust and belief." Brown then concluded, "We will not solve this financial crisis until the people who are the persons we are serving come to trust their political and financial leadership. It simply cannot be solved." Peter emphasized that over and over again, acting in such a way that you inspire trust. Then I've characterized Peter's entire writing as urging responsiveness and responsibility. And that's part of the Drucker Difference. It's part of the lessons that are in this marvelous book. By this I mean, and I'll run through these quickly, flexibility, valuing the people who work with you, seeing them as real assets and not costs, responsibility to one's community, and above all else, the oath of Hippocrates, do no harm. Those principles are taught daily at the Drucker Ethos School, and that is one way in which Peter Drucker shapes teaching and learning at Claremont Graduate School. But there's a broader effect as well, his influence on the whole university. Most of you know by now that Peter Drucker was a Renaissance man. It was manifest in many ways. If you just go through one of his books and count the number of citations from the Greeks, from Roman law, just name it, all the way through Western history. But the one that fascinates me most is his absolute mastery of Japanese art, what that means, and how Japanese art is a way into the heart of what it means to be Japanese. There's a marvelous essay he did in the little booklet that accompanied the Sanso collection over at Scripps, just behind us here. That means that Peter Drucker lived something that is one of the signature parts of the mission of CGU. Now, it is transdisciplinarity. Peter Drucker said you couldn't be a great leader unless you were really good at something other than what you were doing. He tried very hard to immerse himself in art. And he said that made him a better leader because no one really is effective if they're too narrowly focused in leadership. And so I take that to mean that he thinks transdisciplinarity is a characteristic of leadership. And since that's one of the signature parts of the mission of CGU, I see that as a direct influence. I've already mentioned flexibility. We're small, and we tend to be flexible. We have cross-school courses. We have cross-disciplinary courses. We are organized so that we can respond to new trends. And some of the most exciting things I've seen going on in higher education go on in this small school here. And that is partly because we are flexible. And then finally, we are about research. As Peter said, read, and write. We're about research, and we're about education to make a difference. One of the things that is stated in the mission of this school is that we are about educating students and doing research that will make a difference in our community and in the world. So the spirit of Peter Drucker is not alive only in the school that bears his name. It is alive in the university of which this school is a part. And all of us are very proud of that heritage. And I'm delighted again to welcome you here today. And I hope your visit here has been as much pleasure for you as our hosting has been for us. Thank you.
Thank you, President Huff. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Drucker Centennial Day. I'm going to be brief in my recognition of special guests. We have so many. I did want to begin. I haven't seen Doris Drucker this morning, but I know she'll be here, the First Lady of the Drucker School, and I encourage all of you at the break and at lunch to say hello to Doris. It means the world to her. She's smiling, as I think Peter is today, and she's been working very energetically to take advantage of all our Drucker Centennial activities. In fact, she serves as a co-chair of our Drucker Centennial Committee. My name is Ira Jackson. I proudly serve as the Dean of the Peter F. Drucker and Masatoshi Ito Graduate School of Management here at Claremont Graduate University. And the first person I'd like to recognize this morning is our namesake. I think that many of you know that Peter insisted that his dear lifelong friend Masatoshi Ito have his name attached to Peter's school to symbolize the fusion of thought and action, philosophy and entrepreneurial savvy. So we are honored this morning to have Mr. Masatoshi Ito with us and his family. For those of you who might not be aware, Ito-san built from very humble beginnings, a 100-square-foot little store in Tokyo, the largest retail enterprise in Japan, with 45,000 stores around the world. And he did it as a servant leader and according to Drucker principles. We're very proud to have our students, our faculty, and all of us at Claremont Graduate University associated with your name, Masatoshi Ito. Thank you for being here. I also wanted to acknowledge very quickly 3 Claremont Graduate University trustees who are with us this morning: Marilyn Sutton, Doug West, and the chairman of the Drucker School Board of Visitors, as well as a CGU trustee, John Bachman. Would the 3 of you stand, please? going to get in deep trouble if I acknowledge, I think, anyone else. But I did want to shout out to Terry Nichols, if he's here. Are you here, Terry? I think the superintendent of schools of Claremont was bringing a group of high school students. Maybe it's a little early for high school students on a Saturday morning, but we were thrilled to reach out beyond the walls of the Claremont colleges to our neighbors in the public school system. So if you see some kids who aren't old enough to drink coffee and look like they need it, say hello to our friends from Claremont High School. This is the one day each year when we come together as students, faculty, alumni, friends of the community. So I'm going to give you a very brief report on the Drucker Centennial and what's cooking at the Drucker School. The good news is that this will be quick because the dean is not technologically very literate, and I set my PowerPoint to slideshow, so it kind of races through. My words will be trying to catch up with my thoughts, which is what my wife says about me regularly. And the better news is that while we're running late, we're going to move the whole program forward. So we'll have a full hour for Jim Collins, our keynote speaker. We're so grateful to him for coming down from Boulder to grace us this morning. So don't worry about the time or the time that Rick or myself are spending with you at the podium. We'll take a 15-minute break after Jim's keynote address. Then we'll go to our breakout sessions, and there are 15 of them through the day. And they will go for their 1 hour and 15-minute allotted time, and we'll just take 15 or 20 minutes out of our lunch together. So all's well that ends well. Let me tell you a little bit about what's happening at the Drucker School and the Drucker Centennial, which is really a joint initiative of the Peter F. Drucker and Masatoshi Ito Graduate School of Management and CGU's Drucker Institute. This is obviously a 2-year celebration of the life and legacy of the father of modern management, the author of 39 books, the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We honor Peter on this day and throughout the 2-year celebration of the Drucker Centennial. I think more importantly, we recommit ourselves to his principles of effective management, ethical leadership, and social responsibility. We assembled, thank the Lord, they all agreed, a world-class group of Drucker Centennial co-chairs, including A.G. Lafley, the chairman of Procter & Gamble, Pastor Rick Warren, the founder of Teach for America, Wendy Kopp, probably the leading academic leadership scholar in the world, Warren Bennis, Jim Collins, who blesses us with his presence this morning, Ming-Lo Shao, who serves on the board of the Drucker Institute and is the chairman and founder of the Drucker Academy of China, our own Masatoshi Ito, Harvard Business School's Rosabeth Moss Cantor, the youngest graduate of the Drucker School, or he's no longer that young, but he was 20 years old when he received his MBA, Rajiv Dutta, who went on to become the president of PayPal, Skype, and eBay. Frances Hesselbein, herself a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Our own John Bachman, Doris Drucker, Bob Buford, the chairman of the Drucker Institute board, John Byrne, the executive editor of Business Week, Charles Handy, who with his wife Liz has been gracing us with their presence all week long, and CNN's David Gergen, also White House counselor. They have been giving us credibility, lift, stature, and lending their time, talents, and treasure to making the Drucker Centennial a global event, which began last year in this hall where we heard Dan Yankelovich talk about the new pragmatism, and it's been extending around the world. It started in Korea 5 or 6 months ago with a terrific conference attended by 600 business leaders who were committing, and civic leaders who were committing themselves to advance the notion in Korea, an entire nation, of building and transforming Korea from the land of the morning calm into the land of lifelong learning, inspired by Peter Drucker's insights about our being a knowledge economy. We have activities around the world, literally. Mumbai, India, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Buenos Aires, Argentina, Milan, Italy. We started after Korea in New York. Rick and I were there at the World Business Forum this year at Radio City Music Hall, which was transformed into a Drucker Centennial event where we heard people like Gary Hamel, Jeff Sachs, T. Boone Pickens, Paul Krugman, and I had the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, former President Bill Clinton. When we came back to Claremont, we were proud to be able to say that McGraw-Hill and our 18 faculty participants in the Drucker Difference got the book out just in the nick of time. This is the only book I'm aware of by a business school faculty anywhere in the world that's a collective work of all of its faculty around the work of yet another member of its faculty, Peter Drucker. It's already in its second printing by McGraw-Hill. It's been out for 2 weeks, and it indicates and reflects our Gateway course, which is required now of all students at the Drucker School, the Drucker Difference. When we returned to Claremont, Doris and I and Mayor Corey Kaleke, and is he here this morning? He was going to be with us, but helped us in renaming 11th Street between College and Dartmouth Drucker Way. And then we went to China, where there were Drucker Centennial celebrations, thanks to our dear friend Minglo Shao, in 7 cities: Nanchang, Nanjing, Jinan, Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. It was a whirlwind tour, but they've got Drucker religion in China. Here in Claremont for Drucker Week, as Joe mentioned, and I do encourage you to stop by the Sanso Art exhibit just behind us at Scripps College. It's a magnificent collection of 15th, 16th, and 17th century Japanese Zen Buddhist art. Peter, you may know, came to Claremont as a professor of management, of course, but the course he chose to teach first was not at CGU, but rather at Pomona College, and it was a course on Japanese art. So please, we started this. Rick and I thought that this would be a wonderful way to begin the Drucker Centennial celebration here at Claremont, because it reflects Peter's commitment to management as a liberal art and the importance of the arts and philosophy and aesthetics, just as important as accounting or marketing or financial management to effective management. This week has been action-packed. For those of you who missed the activities, it's all available webcast on our website, drucker100.com. We started off with Ken Blanchard, Charles Handy, and Warren Bennis at LA Live in downtown at the Nokia Theater. Someone described them as the 3 tenors. Francis Hesselbein was the next day. Stephen Covey followed, and we've got the baritone himself, Jim Collins, today. So it's been a wonderful week. We're a tiny little institution. I sometimes call us the little engine that could. This is all driven by volunteer efforts, by students, by alumni, by staff working overtime without overtime. And it's thanks to a wonderful and committed team that we've made as much progress, and you'll forgive us for a couple of the imperfections and blemishes during the day, but our intent is sincere, and I think there's a cornucopia of insights to glean from what we're providing you. A little bit on the school. Our faculty is prolific. It's tiny, but it's producing important insights that are shaping thought about management. And you know, as I mentioned, there are 10,000 business schools around the world, 1,000 in America alone. Very few of them have the courage to ask the big questions. That's what Jim Collins challenged us to do. Before I arrived 4 years ago, he spoke here at CGU in a memorial service for Peter, and he said Peter had the courage to ask the big questions. And even though you're a small school, use your flexibility, use your values orientation to pursue the big questions. Net Impact is an organization, a voluntary organization of MBA students who are committed to doing good and doing well. It's the largest MBA association in the world. They rank the Drucker Ito School number 8 in the country because of our values orientation, and I'm very proud to say that 4 members of our Drucker School Student Association were sent to Boulder, Colorado for a national case competition and against 85 of the best, the very best business schools in the nation, Harvard, Kellogg, Stanford. you name them. They came in first. And I think all 4 members are here, and if they'd stand and receive our recognition, please. We're not big believers in rankings at Drucker for a number of reasons. They weigh inordinately the compensation of graduates. We have many graduates who want to go out and change. We hope all of our graduates want to go out and make the world a better place, change it for the better. Many choose to go into the non-for-profit sector. So there are lots of games that are played by those who rank. Princeton Review is actually driven by the voice of the customer. So it's students at business schools ranking their institutions and with one another. And again, it's just directionally indicative of the fact that we're very proud of our faculty. They're deeply engaged not only in cutting-edge research and in service, but in really marvelous teaching, engaged commitment to our students. They're ranked number 5 in the nation, and I'd ask the Drucker School faculty to please stand and be recognized. Some of you may be aware that Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, unveiled a Drucker-like idea called the UN Global Compact. It was the notion that businesses and NGOs would voluntarily commit themselves to advancing the UN's Universal Declaration of Human, Labor, and Environmental Rights. It has now developed over time into the largest organization, voluntary association of corporations committed to social responsibility in the world, and it's being pursued by Ban Ki-moon, the current Secretary General of the United Nations. I had the privilege of presenting to Ban Ki-moon in Geneva 2 summers ago a charter for progressive business schools, 6 of us business school deans from around the world. We articulated what we call principles of responsible management education, and I'm very proud to say that the Drucker School was the first signatory to PRIME. Lots of additional initiatives at your alma mater and at the Drucker Ethos School. We are committed, as Joe mentioned earlier, to transdisciplinarity, and we've begun a number of new joint degrees with our CGU colleagues, our brother and sister institutions, including a cutting-edge degree in risk management and financial engineering with our School of Mathematics, the first of its kind, a MBA in arts management, as well as an executive program in arts management with our School of Arts and Humanities. And next week, Joe and I will have the privilege of joining the president of the Getty Foundation and the Getty Museum in accepting a $2.2 million gift to CGU to bring the Getty Leadership Institute to this institution because of our pioneering work in arts management. We have a new concurrent degree with Southwestern Law School, and we're extremely enthusiastic about a new MBA, MPH degree with CGU's new School of Community and Global Health. We've got another year to go in the Drucker Centennial. It's a 2-year-long celebration. We have a couple of wonderful Drucker Centennial Fellows coming to be with us in residence this spring, including Professor David Cooperrider from Case Western University and Professor Warner Woodworth from Brigham Young University, who's a world-class expert in social entrepreneurship. This is a tremendous opportunity to gain visibility for the school, which has been lacking, and to sustain momentum and even to raise a couple of bucks. So that's the Drucker Centennial. Needless to say, I think it goes without saying that given recent events globally, given the epidemic of greed and irresponsibility, short-sightedness, management myopia, which has caused us to be in such a dilemma as a global economy, for those and other reasons, we need Drucker now more than ever. He said that the best way to predict the future is to create it. With your help, together, we'll create a better future together. I observed last night that Drucker looked back upon the 20th century and said it was a wasted century. I think if we harness some of Peter's principles, some of Jim Collins' insights, and act more responsibly, more effectively, more ethically, perhaps we can make the 21st century the Drucker century. So with that, thank you for listening to me, and let me now introduce the most able and capable and energetic executive director of the Drucker Institute, Rick Wartzman.
What a pleasure to be with you this wonderful morning, this wonderful occasion, capping off just really an incredible week and an incredible centennial period, which will continue once we take a little respite in 2010. So I just want to bring you up to speed on what's happening at the Drucker Institute. I think if our colleagues at the Drucker School are the little engine that could, we're even the littler engine that could. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, and I know many of you are, but for those who are not, the Institute, we originally started as Peter Drucker's archives, and we still maintain that very important function, serving as the official repository for all of Peter's papers, his correspondence, other documents, manuscripts, and so forth. But about 2.5 years ago, we were asked by the university and by the Drucker family to take on an additional role, and a very different role at that. For it had become increasingly clear to them that no archive, right, which is an inherently backward-looking institution, could possibly do justice to Peter's legacy. After all, Peter, as we all know, was all about the future, not about the past. So we've set out to do just that, to propel Peter's teachings into the future, to take his principles to new audiences in new ways. And what we've been finding as our momentum has grown, as we've gained our footing and really figured out who we are and found our focus, that the world really is incredibly receptive to what Peter is all about. This is, of course, because Peter was truly one of the great minds of the 20th century. His insights on organizational behavior and innovation and economy and society and so much more are, of course, unrivaled. And I should add here that we really feel this every day. We feel so privileged to get to try and advance and build on and energize Peter's body of work. It's something we don't take lightly. We are so appreciative of this opportunity, and we feel very responsible for being good stewards of his legacy. As Ira noted, and we don't relish this by any means, we are, I think, the beneficiaries of some extraordinary timing. The global financial meltdown, this crisis that we've all seen, and that, as Ira said, was so clearly brought on by short-term itis and greed and recklessness and a sorry lack of leadership. I think that has really helped more people want to come back and focus on the fundamentals of good management and social responsibility, and that inevitably takes them right back to Peter Drucker. So how are we doing this? How are we trying to get Peter's wisdom out there? Particularly, how are we trying to advance his work, some of which, of course, dates back to the earliest decades of the 20th century. How are we doing this as we head deeper into the 21st? I say, it's pretty amazing to be taking somebody who wrote his first major book in 1939, and here we are kind of repurposing it in an age of, Twitter and blogs, and it's a very different world. But again, those fundamental principles, they still resonate so incredibly clearly. I am lucky enough that every other week I get to write a column for Business Week Online dubbed The Drucker Difference. And this really underscores just what I'm talking about, the continuing relevance of Peter's thinking. I tie his work right to the hottest headlines of the day. So recent topics have included the collapse of the American auto industry, our troubled healthcare system, excessive CEO pay, right, all of which he had so much to say, and all of which, again, issues that just continue to make the headlines. On the off week, when I'm not doing my column, the Institute, we distribute a social media tool called Drucker Apps. This is a downloadable collection of, we hope, useful insights on work and life from Peter, as well as like-minded thinkers and practitioners we do original video and audio interviews with. And it ties Peter's timeless wisdom to the most pressing issues of today, all delivered now by the latest in 21st century technology, PR web and Twitter. We post this all on our YouTube channel. We target bloggers and so forth. If you don't get Drucker Apps already, it's very easy to sign up. Just go to our homepage at druckerinstitute.com, and you can easily register. Joe Maciarello, the Institute's academic and research director and a longtime Drucker School professor, continues to do really just amazing work. Last year, Joe finished revising Peter's magnum opus, Management, Tasks, Responsibilities, Practices. This was just a monumental undertaking by Joe, in which he both updated and distilled not only the original book, but wove in somehow 3 decades of Peter's subsequent thinking and writing, and in the process, the book actually got shorter, too. I have no idea how he did that. You may also notice that the foreword to Management was written by some guy named Jim Collins. So, these days, Joe is off tackling a new project exploring Peter's concept of management as a liberal art. And Joe is finishing up a monograph on this topic. The monograph will be turned into a full-blown curriculum, and the idea is to eventually seed the curriculum throughout the broader academic community. Ultimately, of course, the real aim is to affect the realm of practice, to do this by infusing business education with lessons from the humanities, an approach that could help MBAs find a moral and ethical compass that, as I've said and as others have said, has been all too missing these days. And at the same time, liberal arts educators would be armed with a way to teach their students about effectiveness and action and achieving results. Meantime, the Institute's latest product is called Drucker Unpacked. It's a series of do-it-yourself workshops in a box, is designed to help managers and their teams quickly grasp some of Peter's core concepts and then turn his ideas into action. We officially unveiled Unpacked just a few weeks back at the World Business Forum in New York, and I'd encourage all of you to check it out at the expo that's taking place here today, and to think about how you can bring a little bit of Peter into your organization. It really is a great way to give your team a lift. And I should note that a Drucker Unpacked kit will also be one of the raffle items being given away later today. Our annual Peter F. Drucker Award for Nonprofit Innovation will be handed out next month. This year's first prize winner is the Center for Court Innovation. This was founded as a public-private partnership between the New York State Unified Court System and the Fund for the City of New York. The center serves as the court's kind of independent R&D arm, creating demonstration projects that test new ideas. The center's projects include community courts, drug courts, reentry courts, domestic violence courts, and mental health courts, all of which have demonstrated really extraordinary results in aiding victims, reducing crime, and improving public trust in the justice system. Thanks to the generosity of the Coca-Cola Foundation, this year's award will increase from $35,000 to $100,000. And it's really a wonderful way, this program, which has been going on since 1991, to discover leading innovators in the social sector, whether large or small, to recognize and celebrate their example and inspire others. As Ira noted, we are fortunate enough to get to host some really wonderful Drucker Fellows along with the Drucker School, leading thinkers and doers with Drucker-like insights and values, in addition to David Cooperrider and Warner Woodworth, who Ira mentioned, who will be coming. We also know that coming before too long will be Procter & Gamble Chairman A.G. Lafley, who will be coming to spend a couple weeks with us. And in fact, A.G. was recently on campus to host this Drucker Centennial CEO Forum. That event brought together 32 top corporate executives, social sector leaders, and academics for a day of dialogue about the unique role of the CEO in the 21st century. This was a theme that AG first began exploring here in Claremont with Peter Drucker. Perhaps most exciting of all to me is our global network of Drucker societies. Are all volunteer organizations that are really out there now applying Peter's ideas and ideals in their local communities. There are now 28 societies in 16 countries on 5 continents. But it's really beyond the numbers that things are happening, and this is, of course, what really counts. We're beginning to see the kind of activity that Peter would be truly proud of, that is, activity generating meaningful and measurable results. Our Drucker societies in Korea and Japan and New York are regularly convening hundreds of business people and academics and others to talk about and apply, and again the key word is apply, Peter's writing in a dynamic book club model that we call reading for results. So they read and then they go and actually track what they've learned and how it's being put into practice. In Dallas and Kansas City, our Drucker Society affiliates in Israel and in Palestine now, Drucker Society members are training hundreds of nonprofit and NGO leaders in Peter's principles on effectiveness. In Philadelphia and Northern California, but also in India and Brazil and the Philippines, our Drucker Society volunteers are putting on a program on social responsibility for corporate leaders, something we've dubbed Closing the Responsibility Gap. In China, our Drucker Society volunteers from local universities are working with businesses to help them grasp some of Peter's key insights. And in Dubai, would-be women entrepreneurs traditionally locked out of the business community are learning Peter's concepts on innovation and entrepreneurship. And then right here in LA, we've piloted a program that's now extended, actually. It's also being run out of a school in LA. It's also being done at Claremont High. And again, we welcome those Claremont High students who are here with us today. And it's going to be rolled out to 10 other schools in the LA region this year. And this is a Drucker in High Schools program where we are teaching some of Peter's key management principles to 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. And they're then using these principles to guide their own community service projects, as well as learning his teachings on managing oneself to put them on a firmer path to college. In all of these activities, I'd be remiss if I didn't make a special thank you to the Institute's Board of Advisors, and there are several members of the board here today. They've been generous both financially and also with their wise counsel, and none more so than the man it is my pleasure to introduce to you now. Bob Buford is the chairman of the Drucker Institute board. He is an author. He was a very successful businessman. He's a self-described entrepreneurial nonprofit philanthropist. He was the founding chairman of the board of governors of the Peter F. Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management, now the Leader to Leader Institute in New York. In 1984, Bob started the Leadership Network, a private operating foundation to identify and provide resources for senior ministers and staff of large church congregations in the United States. In 1998, Bob launched what became Halftime, an organization to help people move from success to significance in their lives. And the following year, he concluded his own 35-year career in the communications business by selling Buford Television, where he had been the chairman. He is the author of several books, including the bestseller Halftime, Changing Your Game Plan from Success to Significance, Game Plan, Winning Strategies for the Second Half of Your Life, Stuck in Halftime, reinvesting your one and only life, and finishing well. Bob, who received one of our Drucker Centennial Leadership Awards last night, along with John Bachman and Masatoshi Ito, was also one of Peter Drucker's closest friends. And I have to say that I'm just so glad that over the last few years, he has become a friend of mine as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Buford.
Well, of all of that, I think what pleased me most is to say that I was one of Peter Drucker's closest friends. I'm here to introduce Jim Collins, not to talk about me. I got from Collins' office, he's a very meticulous person, a list of all these things that he's accomplished, but he gave me permission not to use that list. So what I'm going to do is tell you what I've learned about him the last couple of days, just flying on an airplane and driving around in a car around Claremont. Hoping to introduce you to the real Jim Collins. He'll have his subject matter, I'm sure, and we'll learn a lot. The first thing I'd say about Jim Collins is he's relentless. Driving over here this morning, he said that he budgets his time 50% for writing, 30% for teaching. Today's a teaching day, and the balance for stuff, everything else. He like Rick Warren said last night, neither Collins nor Warren own a television set. When he is in book mode, he works 16 hours a day, but it does include a rock climb in the middle of the day and a nap. After which he goes back to work. The purpose of the nap is to get him back to work. He has a wonderful relationship with his wife Joanne, who used to at least be able to outrun him up the mountain, and is kind of a she's petite, but she's an Amazon. Well, I mean, she won the Ironman triathlon in some place. Anyway, strange. I don't think he rests any. I asked him this morning whether he ever rested, and he does. He rests on the clock. I mean, like the nap. He said he was 49 point some odd % on budget for writing this year, and then he corrected that and said actually he's 50%. So he's that close. I don't know how you celebrated your birthday. Jim celebrated his birthday, his 50th birthday, by climbing the El Capitan straight up, which is the most about straight up and down thing you've ever seen in Yosemite, and which he describes as the Tour de France of rock climbing. In a day, 40 hours straight up, no meals, no naps, no pauses, I don't believe. The second thing I'd say about him is he is infectiously curious. You just really don't want to be around him much if you don't want to get questioned. He's a friendly interrogator, but a fairly relentless friendly interrogator. I'll give you an example. He and I were having dinner in Dallas And he asked me, do you think Peter Drucker would have been more influential if he had written less? You know, he did write 10,000 book pages and lots of magazine articles and so on. And as he told Rick Warren last night, first I just denied to answer the question, but I finally said, no, I don't think so, because he established the platform for all the rest of the people to write on, that he connected the dots, so to speak, in the whole, he really created an industry which is called management. I personally believe that if the Nobel Peace Prize, not Economics Prize, committee had had any good sense or imagination at all, that Peter would have gotten the Peace Prize, because I think management's had more to do with the stability of Western culture than any other single fact. Just go someplace where it's mismanaged, and you really wouldn't want to be in Darfur or one of those crazy places like that. Anyway, that question just continued to bug me all along, and it has, in a way, resulted, not through any effort of my own, in Joe Masciarello doing a remarkable thing in this management book. I mean, you should get, this book is really 40 11-page pamphlets on subjects. And that's how he wrote less. I don't know how Joe came up with that. I don't know how he got 60 years into one book of 40 11-page pamphlets. But the 40 11-page pamphlets have transformed themselves into Drucker Unpacked, which uses, more than anything else, uses icons to talk about how to do planned abandonment or how to make decisions or things like that, which I never would have thought of this until Rick Warren said it last night. You know, there's still a good part of the world that is languageless. I mean, that are functionally illiterate. So words don't do much for them. And they think in terms of images and pictures. If you think of the whole Renaissance, the way Christianity developed was looking at stained glass windows, pictures, not words and concepts and that kind of thing. And this Drucker Unpacked is just, it's just stunning. And it is it's a direct result of making Peter write less. There are 15 modules of things like the theme of theory or business and things like that, and you can actually get it. I mean, you can get it top to bottom. So go buy that thing and, you know, use it. Then next to the last thing I want to say, to embarrass my friend, is there's a writer named Annie Dillard who I like a lot, and Annie Dillard says the greatest of all gifts is the gift to see. And in my opinion, the two people in the last 2 centuries who saw most clearly, saw the brutal facts, so to speak, were, in the 19th century, were Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat who came and had fresh eyes to see the United States, and Peter Drucker, who had was kind of a relentless looker himself. And it could be that at least my early candidate for the 21st century might be Jim Collins. He spends a day a page on what he does. I mean, he goes over it and over it and over it, and it allows us to see through his eyes, which is the gift we're going to get this morning. Last thing I would say is he is a dependable friend. He said in the car on the way over here that there were 3 things you could do about a commitment, like the commitment to be here this morning. You know, there's an old joke that where you call someone up and ask if they believe in free speech, and if they say yes, you say, well, I've got a deal for you. I have an opportunity for you to give a free speech. And given the fact that he gets paid about $1,000 a minute to do his unfree speeches, this is a gift. And he said there are 3 things you can do about a commitment. You can either get an unqualified release from it, or you can do it, or you can die. And so he's going to do it this morning. Here he is.
I'm here and I'm very much alive. I am really very passionate to be here with you and to be really among friends. Friends like Bob Buford and John Bachman, with Rick Wartzman and Ira Jackson and the wonderful things they're doing with the school and the Institute, which I applaud, and I expect remarkable things to come. With friends from the faculty, and also to be among a kind of a role model friend from afar, which is Doris Drucker. And it's interesting because I was talking with my wife Joanne on the phone this morning about chatting briefly last night with Doris, and we were just talking about how we always looked at, I've always looked at, of course, Peter as a great role model. But I also always have admired their marriage, their relationship, also as a role model. And we were saying, yeah, you know, if you look at that kind of a role model, we've been married now 29 years, and we got engaged 4 days after our first date. And we were saying, you know, with that role model in mind, 29 years is really nothing other than just a nice start. So. It's also really a privilege to be here in the environment of Claremont and the Drucker School, because I actually think that it plays a very important role in the world of thinking and of academics, and this idea of it being a place for conversations, right? A place for conversations, and a place for conversations on important topics that matter. And of course, we know that that's exactly how Peter Drucker interacted, was through that constant series of conversations, and the idea of having that as an entire ethos of an institution. And I think that's a very important legacy of both Peter Drucker and of the institution. And so it is a privilege to try to contribute to that in some small way here today. I have been asked to honor Peter not by looking back and articulating all the ways in which he was a great man, and of course, he was a great man, but by looking ahead a bit at our changing world, and perhaps through that lens, building upon some timeless principles. But before I do that, I would like to set a context a bit, and to shine a light on Peter through my own lens. Bob Buford mentioned something in his comments, and I've reflected on this a lot, and I believe it is true. The idea that Peter Drucker contributed more to the triumph of freedom and free society over totalitarianism as anyone in the 20th century, including perhaps Winston Churchill. And that may sound like an audacious statement, but as I think about it, it has to be true, right? There are 2 ways to change the world, the sword and the pen. And those who use the pen rewire the brains of those who wield the swords. There are people of ideas and people of of action, and Peter chose the pen. And really, for free society to function, we absolutely must have high-performing and self-managed organizations spread throughout society. And it's really actually the reason why we're able to have this great melee called democracy. What was it that Churchill said is absolutely the most hideous, awful, completely irrational, inefficient form of government ever devised except for all the others. And he also said about us Americans, of course, we'll always do the right thing after we've tried everything else. But if you think about it, that there's a natural inconsistency in democratic systems, and nothing great happens in the context of inconsistency, so what's the solution to that? The solution to that is that spread throughout, and people like city managers, and people in nonprofits, and people in business corporations, and people in organizations, they are the ones who lead and manage in a way that produce the consistency that produce real results. And it is only the relationship between those two, between the consistent, well-managed individual organizations that might now be creating movements with the kind of inherent inconsistency of democracy which allows us to have freedom, that we get a workable combination. And of course, Drucker gave us the language, the metaphor, the lens, the understanding of the role of management as the critical function. It has become fashionable in recent years to revere the idea of leadership, which I think is great, but to kind of implicitly denigrate the idea of management. And the idea behind, you'll have people who will kind of think of it as that the leaders are the ones who are cool, right? The leaders are the ones who, we all want to be the leaders. We want to have the black leather jacket and the cool sunglasses, and we want to lead, and we want to be, charismatic, and we want to be all these things. And kind of the managers, well, that's just management. And management is sort of more mundane and pedestrian, and nothing could be further from the truth. Leadership without effective management, and especially, as Rick Warren mentioned last night, charismatic leadership without effective management, is not only ineffective, it is dangerous. But of course, Drucker knew this and pointed it out more than 60 years ago. And if we think that the world is permanently and irrevocably beyond the reach of totalitarian dictators, that freedom will always triumph, never with a step backward, I would simply remind us of our history. It is not on our side. Most of the world's most dangerous and powerful totalitarian states came long after 500 BCE Greece, which was the birthplace of the notion of the republic and the democracy. And look what happened in between. There is no law that says it is an inevitable march to free society. And I believe that freedom wins, as Drucker taught us, in direct proportion to our ability to self-manage. If we deliver organizations that deliver results throughout society. In my own first encounter with Drucker's contribution, it really came through a research lens. And my colleague Jerry Porras and I were engaged in a research project at Stanford where we were trying to understand what separated truly enduring great companies from others over long periods of time. And we were going back into historical archives. So for example, of companies like Hewlett-Packard and Merck and Motorola and Johnson & Johnson and General Electric. And we were studying these companies over the long course of their evolution. And so you'd be going through boxes of archive material at places like HP, and you actually have David Packard's original typewritten notes from the very, very first meeting on August 23rd, 1937 at 2 p.m. in the afternoon when he and Bill Hewlett got together to form Hewlett-Packard. By the way, there's a very interesting little side note on that. It's very fun. They didn't know what they were going to make, which I've always just loved. They get together and say, we decided to form a company in the radio, electronics, and electrical engineering field, very broadly defined. And then it goes on to say, the question of what we will design, manufacture, and sell, however, was postponed. And this is the founding of the company. But if you think of it, it was a very Drucker-like approach, because what they essentially were saying is, our ultimate contribution, our ultimate product is not going to be a calculator or an oscillator. It's going to be an organization that has values. And if we build the right organization with values, it will do remarkable things. But that is our creation, not a product, not a specific, though all that stuff changes. And as we started looking inside these organizations, and we were studying them, and I was not particularly familiar with Drucker's work as in depth, kept coming across these notes, and I kept picturing like David Packard standing up in the early formative days of HP, waving a practice of management and giving a sermon to all of the people about what you're going to do. If you go back and you look at the original statement of Hewlett-Packard objectives, written by David Packard in 1957 before they went public, because he said, we're going to have pressures of the markets if we go public. So what we have to do is we have to be very clear what we are before we hit that pressure. Writes down what later became the basis of the HP way, but was really what he called these 10 objectives. Objectives, where's the word objectives come from? Right from Drucker, right? He writes them down, and if you read those 10 points, they are straight out of the practice of management. It should not have been the Hewlett-Packard Company. It should have been the Hewlett-Packard Drucker Company, HPD. And this was true across many of the companies that we studied. And what I realized is there was these intellectual fingerprints at pivotal stages of these enterprises, and as we were struggling with what to name the book that came out of this, we tossed aside 125 titles in frustration. Our publisher was going nuts because we just kept vetoing all of our titles. Finally, I just blurted out one day, why don't we just name it Drucker Was Right, and we're done. And we ended up calling it Built to Last, which of course he was. The interesting thing, we talk about this question of Drucker now more than ever. I don't believe that that is just a slogan in any way. It is an empirical fact from our research. This is not a perspective, it's not a philosophy, it is an empirical fact that if you look systematically at those that became great in contrast to those that do not, and you look at those that were great that lost it, that fell, and you ask the question, two choices. Those that fall A, because they fail to learn the new stuff as it comes along, or B, because they fail to implement with excellence the timeless principles we already know to be true. The answer is very clearly B. It is very hard to argue that the financial crisis we went through is because all of the financial institutions were adhering to fundamental sound disciplined management. I believe that Peter's impact, and others may have different views, this is just my peculiar lens, derives not just from the specific ideas, but from his approach to ideas, an approach that has had a huge influence on the way I like to think about ideas, and others have had to think about ideas. And I think this approach, at least the part that kind of jumped out at me, has 4 parts to it. The first is, number 1, he was deeply empirical. And what I mean by empirical is not necessarily quantitative data. What I mean is, you go out and you look, as he always talked about, look out the window, see what's actually out there. Don't try to think what the world should be. Look at what the world actually is. And based upon that empirical observation, then to derive insights. You look out there, then you derive theory, rather than deriving theory and looking out and trying to make the world fit your theory. I think this is why he always loved to interact with people. Bob told the story last night about meeting with the early megachurch leaders. They weren't called that at that time. And it's because I think that's where he was getting empirical evidence. And when I asked him, I said, why do you consult? Why do you work with companies? He said, that's my laboratory, right? That's empirical, hands-on. Number two, oh, and by the way, on the empirical, if you look at the other great thinkers, like Darwin, they were also empirical. I mean, you read pages and pages and pages about pigeons, but from which comes a single elegant idea. That was Drucker's approach as well. Number two, he started first and always with results, asking a simple question, what actually works, and then asking the question, why does it work? I recall a conversation I had with a faculty member when I was teaching at Stanford, and we were discussing people that had influenced our thinking, and I said, well, I really admire Peter Drucker. And this faculty member had an absolutely remarkable response, which was he kind of wrinkled his nose in this kind of disdainful response and said, Drucker? Oh, but he's so practical. I think Peter Drucker would have loved that. He's so practical. But it was never just kind of the details of the moment. If you pick up a copy of Concept of the Corporation, you don't go into it and say, this is a how-to book on how to build a corporation. It was by going into the real empirical and the real practical aspects of things, but then zooming way out and asking the big question. What is the role of the corporation in the evolution of society at this stage of human history? So you get this wonderful blend of practical and very big questions, which brings me to the third aspect of his approach. He had the courage to ask the audacious questions. I remember a conversation I had with another role model and person I admired greatly, John Gardner, who wrote Self-Renewal and on leadership and Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Johnson administration. And John Gardner, when I was talking with him about do I want to do a full traditional academic career and end up doing a type of research that would lead me into that kind of normal path, he said that would be fine, it'd be a good use of your brain, but be aware of what has tended to happen. Beware of the tendency to answer questions of increasing irrelevance with increasing precision. And I believe that what Drucker had the courage to do was to say, you know, not all important questions can be answered with increasing precision, but it doesn't prevent you from, in the end, being right. And his approach was to ask questions of increasing significance with increasing empirical rigor. And I believe that my own view is there was one overriding question, which is how do we make society not only more productive, but more productive and more humane? And then finally, the great signature of it all, and I'll return to this at the end because I'm going to go to the questions aspect here, is that everything was infused with a tremendous compassion and deep concern for the well-being of the individual. You know, if you built companies that destroyed people, if you built well-managed organizations and destroyed human beings in the process, this would be a failure. And I'm going to return to the individual aspect here maybe towards the end. Show of hands, how many young people do we have here? I have to be careful how I define young. I keep changing that as I go along. But just for, okay, I'm not going to say young or old, but how many are under the age of 30 in this room? Wonderful. At the end, you and I are going to have a little chat, at least for a bit. I have some thoughts for you I've brought. Okay, so what I would like to do is to spend a few minutes in this notion of looking forward, teeing up some questions. I don't know if I have real good answers for these questions. But what might be questions that, I don't know if Peter would ask them today or not, but they're questions that occur to me as we look forward. I'm going to suggest 3 or 4 of them, depending on my time. And I brought about 10, but we'll have enough time for 3 or 4. The first question that occurs to me is, how do we build legions of level 5 leaders And as we have engaged in our research, what we do is we're always comparing those that did something exceptional and built a great company in contrast to others that did not. And I had always, at the very beginning of that process, discounted the role of the individual leader. It always struck me as a great plug figure, right? It basically said, when we said it's all leadership, we basically were saying we're ignorant. Because what we say is, well, we believe the answer is leadership. If something was successful, it must have been great leadership. We went in a circle. What did we learn? And so I said to the Good to Great research team as we were embarking on the research, we will not have a leadership answer in Good to Great, which is, of course, highly conducive to their freedom of thought. And I have this strange genetic need to surround myself with young people who really don't care what I think. And as the great Professor Hal Levitt used to like to say, the best students are those who never quite believe they're professors. So one day I walked into the research team meeting, the whole team had joined hands. And I thought, well, that's a little different. What's up? And they said, today, Jim, is the day we've decided to tell you that you are wrong. Well, what about? About this anti-leadership bias that you have. See, if we look at the companies that really made these Good to Great leaps, you can't take the leaders out of the equation. I mean, to remove Cork Walgreen from the Walgreen story, or Coleman Mockler from the Gillette story, or Dick Cooley from the Wells Fargo story, is to ignore the data. You tell us to pay attention to the data, not to you. We invoke that here today. You are wrong. And I pushed back and I said, yes, but what about the comparison companies? The companies that didn't make it. They also had leaders. They also had leadership. Would anyone on the team like to argue that Lee Iacocca was not a leader? Chrysler's a comparison company. Anybody want to argue that Jack Eckert of Eckert was not a leader, but Eckert was a comparison company? You cannot say that the differential was leadership. They both had leadership. It's like an equation. Numerator, denominator, crosses out, goes away, wrote it on the whiteboard, sat down and said, let's go do something useful. And the team, their hands tightened. And they said, we thought you would say that, and we did our homework. And this is when the research team had a really remarkable empirical observation that led to an insight. Yes, both sets of companies had leaders. But the Good to Great leaders were different than the comparisons. They had different cloth. And this is where we had this insight of the level 5 leader, that leadership is a hierarchy of capabilities, and level 1 is about individual capabilities. Level 2 is about your ability to play well with others, right? Team capabilities. Level 3 is good, competent, effective management. Level 4 is then to blend that with the ability to set direction and to lead. But there is a level that ties them all together. And the 5, the signature of the 5, was their humility. I mean, this was an empirical observation that what separated the truly exceptional, the true great winners who did this, was not their great animus, it was their humility. Defined really as an ability to channel their ambition into something bigger than themselves, and it wasn't about them. So it was really interesting talking to Rick Warren last night. Remember the first line of his book, right? It's not about you. Well, that's a religious book. We're doing an empirical study, drawing upon thousands of years of combined historical and statistical. We're selecting based on stock returns. We find the same sentence. They understood. It's not about you. When I look at some of the people who have been associated with this event, people like Bob Buford and John Bachman and Francis Hesselbein and Rick Warren and Ito-san, Toyota, what do they all share in common? They are exemplars of the fact that they are incredibly ambitious, but not for themselves. And this is the 5. I worry, my question is, which way are we going as a society? Are we going down to where increasingly it's going to be those who are ambitious primarily for themselves who will be the dominant strain? Or will it be the level 5s who will be the dominant strain? If it's the former, we go the way of Rome. So we don't have a choice. And when you look inside, as we've had the privilege to do it, even difficult things like education, where we had the privilege to study what separated schools. The Center for the Future of Arizona did this. I just happened to be sort of the thesis advisor, looking at schools in poor Latino neighborhoods, public schools with all of the constraints of public schools. And yet some managed to beat the odds and to overperform and to deliver outstanding educational results for those kids. And you compare them to other schools that are in the exact same circumstances, with the exact same constraints and the exact same teachers' unions and the exact same limited budgets and the same kinds of communities who don't overperform. The answer cannot be their circumstances. And what was really different was that in every one of their schools, there was a level 5 leader like Julie Tate Peach, who took responsibility to make her school in Yuma, Arizona, a pocket of greatness that would deliver outstanding results. And I got into an argument with a senator of the United States of America at a session I had a privilege to do with a group of senators about education. And it was an argument back and forth. And the senator was arguing the most important thing is to increase the budget. And my response is, if you increase the budget threefold, but you don't have an army of Julie Tate Peaches, it doesn't matter. How do we have a West Point for education? How do we have level 5 leaders deployed into those principles? That's how we make it work. And how do we build armies? And of course, that's what Claremont is all about. Now, let me give you a hopeful side, because I think there's a lot of dark side to that. It's pretty hard to argue that what we've watched in the last year is principally played out because of people who weren't ambitious for themselves. I have great faith in our self-corrective ability. And perhaps we don't even just have level 5 leaders, but this young generation coming up. As the Chief of Staff of the Army said to me at a session at West Point, this is the most inspired and inspiring generation to come through West Point since 1945. I should get out of the way, let them lead. Maybe we have a level 5 generation in the making. And the sooner we can get that level 5 generation into positions of responsibility and power, the better off I believe we will be. So my friends who are under 30, we'll get out of your way. But there's a challenge, an issue. And what I worry about for this up-and-coming generation, what I worry about for this wonderfully idealistic, collaborative, inspired generation, is that they grew up in a historical anomaly. How many times in human history do we have the combination of global stability, which was provided by having 2 superpowers and then 1, and almost unbroken prosperity at the same time? This is not the normal mode of history. 280 Rome, 500 BCE Greece, 2000 BCE Egypt. We can go through a few in history, but it's not the norm. The norm is usually instability. And unbroken prosperity is not also the norm. So they grew up in a kind of an artificial time. And so my next question is, how do we prepare ourselves, and how does the young generation prepare itself for the ferocious instability that is about to descend upon us? I'd like you to picture waking up at below Mount Everest, at base camp. And a big storm comes blasting through the valley, and you can hunker down in your tent, and when the storm clears, you can emerge and you can go climbing again. But what happens if instead of being in the safety and security, the stability and prosperity of base camp, you wake up as a vulnerable little speck at 27,000 feet on the side of the mountain, where the storms are bigger and faster, everything more uncertain, everything more out of control. There you are not prepared. There you are not psychologically prepared. You are not physically prepared. There you might be in real trouble. And what we have just been going through might be more of a wake-up call that we're at 27,000 feet. And we're very unlikely to be able to go back to the nice, safe stability of base camp. We're up on the mountain. And if, in fact, the last 30 years were the anomaly, then we're going to be on that mountain. Now, I'm confident prosperity will return. It's what we know how to do. I'm not at all confident that stability is going to return. And speaking as an American, and I know not everyone in this room is American, this is where I think we are particularly exposed to the competitors from outside the United States. When I meet with my friends from, say, Russia, I had a group come to my laboratory from Russia. They're in their late 30s, early 40s, running this giant company in Russia. And you realize that in their late teens or 20s, they woke up one morning and their entire world had evaporated. The tenets that they had grown up with, gone. The economy doesn't work. The entire social system overturned. Now they've had to learn how to operate in this other mode. Wow! And what you realize when we were talking about the economic crisis, they said, oh, we don't worry that much about the economic crisis. We have a different term. We just call it new economic conditions. And I talked to my friends from Brazil who grew up with things like 30% a month inflation at times, where you always make sure that you take a cab, not a bus. Because you see, you pay for the cab ride at the end and inflation helps you over the course of the ride. Or my friends from Argentina who say, in Argentina, even the past is unpredictable. Here's my point. People in India, Brazil, Russia, emerging Africa, they've already been climbing at 27,000 feet, and they know how to do it. And we are going to have to learn how to do it. Now, in speaking to our young folks on this, I would like to give you a way of thinking that has been enormously helpful to me, that came from the Good to Great research for dealing with great difficulty. And it was what we came to call the Stockdale Paradox. And the Stockdale Paradox was taught to us by, when we were doing the Good to Great research, we're trying to make sense of the CEOs. And in doing that, I just by chance happened to get to know Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was the highest ranking military officer in the Hanoi Hilton, shot down in 1967, was there till 1974. They could pull him out at any time and torture him, and they did. He was tortured over 20 times. And I had the privilege to get to know Admiral Stockdale, and we were going to the faculty club one day, and I had read his book, In Love and War, which was written in alternating chapters by himself and his wife about their years when he was in the camp. And I got depressed reading the book because it seemed so bleak, it seemed so difficult, it seemed, it's like we can all endure anything if we know it's going to come to an end and we know when. But what if you don't know if it's ever going to come to an end? And you certainly don't know when. So I asked Admiral Stockdale how he dealt with that, and he said, you have to realize I never got depressed because I never, ever wavered in my faith that not only I would get out, but I would turn being in the camp into the defining event of my life that in retrospect I would not trade. Later, when we were up the hill, I asked him, I said, Admiral Stockdale, who didn't make it out as strong as you? And he said, easy, it was the optimists. I said, the optimists? You sounded optimistic. He said, no, I was not optimistic. I never wavered in my faith that I would prevail in the end, but I was not optimistic. I said, what's the difference? Oh, the optimists always thought we'd be out by Christmas. Of course, Christmas would come and it would go. And then we were going to be out by Easter and Thanksgiving, and then Christmas would come again, and they died of a broken heart. And that's when Admiral Stockdale grabbed me by the shoulders and said, this is what I learned. When you're imprisoned by great calamity, by great difficulty, by great uncertainty, you have to, on the one hand, never confuse the need for unwavering faith that you will find a way to prevail in the end, with, on the other hand, the discipline to confront the most brutal facts we actually face. And we're not getting out of here by Christmas. As I speak to this wonderful up-and-coming Level 5 generation, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's going to be running for the U.S. Senate, and I asked him why. He said, nationally, as we encounter great challenge, we must have the Stockdale Paradox. And as you get hit by the things we might get hit by, never lose faith and to never deny those brutal facts. That's the starting point for our preparation. Two related thoughts on that particular question. And it really ties to the Drucker School, it ties to the Drucker Institute, it ties to Claremont, and it ties to Peter. I mentioned earlier the work built to last. It was very interesting. We were studying enduring great companies in contrast to others. I went back recently and realized we selected the study set for that study in 1989, 2 decades ago. All 18 of the built-to-last companies are still standalone, independent, and almost all of them very successful companies today. If you took a random sample of large publicly traded companies 20 years ago, what are the probabilities that all 18 in your random sample would be standalone, independent, and largely successful today? The number is less, the percentage is about 0.02% probability. Not only that, 15 of the 18 built-to-last companies lived through the 1930s depression. What do they teach us? What has enabled them to have that? What did we find that separated them? And what we found is that what really separated them was not necessarily that they had smarter strategies, although they often did, or that they were sort of more financially savvy, although they often were. It was because they were founded first and foremost and built always on a rock-solid set of core values that are not open for negotiation. And if you look at what gave them the reason to struggle, the reason to fight, the reason to endure, it wasn't strategic, it was values. And that is what this school teaches. The great irony is people think that values are soft. I've never understood that idea. The second point is we have now done 2 decades of research studying those that do well in contrast to those that do not, across 6 different studies, 2 in the social sectors, 4 in business, 7,000 years of combined corporate data, and all different kinds of lenses and industries and so forth. I would like to suggest, maybe even assert as an empirical fact, something that stands out. And as we face this difficult world that we're heading into, not that we're leaving, we're heading into, the evidence is overwhelming. Whether you prevail or fail, endure or die, whether you build something great, whether you build greatness out of calamity or from scratch, depends largely on what you do to yourselves, not on what the world does to you. And something that Peter had always said, but now we have seen empirically in our research, there is no question that no matter what the world throws at us, our destiny, our fate, and this is an empirical fact, lies largely, maybe not entirely, but predominantly in our own hands, from our own disciplines and our own choices. My third and probably last question, so I have time to speak to our young people here a little bit, but it leads into that. How do we increase the percentage of people on the planet who find and live the three circles of their personal hedgehog concept? Okay, so we'll just kind of go into the idea of managing yourself, but then scaling it up through organizations. If you think about sort of how people apply themselves, when we go back and we look at the good to great data and some of the other data, we find that there's these three circles, and you put your energies in the middle of three circles. And the first circle is what you're passionate about and what you love to do and what you stand for. And the second circle is what you can be the best at, and the third circle is what drives your economic engine. Okay, now, and you focus your energies there, but let's drop that down a level to the individual. How many of the folks under age 30 in here have had cross your mind the thought, I wonder what I'm going to do with myself? Okay. I'd like you to think then about finding your own three circles at an individual level, which is, think about it this way. Imagine that you could engage your energies and your time directly in the middle of three tests. First, it is something for which you have great passion, that you love to do, and that absolutely reflects your values. And when you wake up in the morning, there's this sense of, my goodness, even if I'm getting paid for this, I would want to do it even if I wasn't getting paid for it. Now imagine if in addition to that, you could marry it to a second circle, which is finding what you're genetically encoded for. And there's a big difference of what you're good at and what you're genetically encoded for. I discovered this as a young person. I went off to college. I thought I would be a mathematician. I had done well on math tests. But when I entered courses like real analysis, I met those who were genetically encoded for math. Not being one of them, I needed to find another version of my three circles. And now imagine the third circle. As you're engaged in something that is of great value. It's of either social or economic or both of value. It makes a contribution. You are useful. Now imagine you have all three. Man, I'm passionate about this. I love to do it. It expresses my values. I'm genetically encoded to do it. When I do it, I feel like a fish in water. And then finally, third, I'm useful. And what percentage of the world do you think has that? 5%? Maybe not even. What would happen to the world if, let's say it's 3%, if we then made it 20% of people who are doing what they're passionate about, genetically encoded for, and are useful, are in positions of real contribution and value? Now, I don't know the answer of how we make that percentage go up. But linking back to the idea of Maslow, how did he describe self-actualization? It wasn't hanging out on the beach. He defined self-actualization as discovering what you were meant to do and committing to the ardor of pursuing it with excellence. The purpose of free society, I would suggest, is to systematically increase the percentage of people who do exactly that. And then they can do it for very long periods of time. We were over at the Institute yesterday, and there's this bookshelf with all of Peter Drucker's books. And I asked a question, Bob mentioned this last night, which book, as it was laid out chronologically, did he write when he was 65? Management. If you look on the shelf, where does it fall? 1/3 of the way through. Not 2/3, 1/3. 2/3 come after the age of 65. Isn't that just wonderful and intimidating? As a last question, and I don't need to spend a lot of time on that, as we look at people who are getting older and older, and we're young at 60 and 70 and 80, how do we reverse this tendency to think that at 65 our work is behind us? If we look at that bookshelf, actually we should look at it as when we hit 65, everything has been a preparation. And only 1/3 of our best work is done. When I asked Peter Drucker, when he was 86, which of his 26 books at that point he was most proud of, he said, "I'm still working on it, the next one." Now within that, I will leave one question for those who have moved in what Bob likes to think of as halftime. I think there's a question that does deserve an answer. It might be one that I channel some of my energies into. For those who are thinking about being useful after they've been successful, I was at a gathering of philanthropists, people who are successful business people that have moved into philanthropy, and I brought a question. What systematically separates successful business people who become great and effective philanthropists from successful business people who become mediocre philanthropists? They had never thought about the question. They thought it was simply good enough to become a philanthropist. I would suggest it is not. And yet the interesting thing is we don't really know what separates. With one thing that came out of the conversation, those who are the great and effective focused on results and not on credit. And so, as we bring my time to a close, I would like to now speak to our young people and give you 10 to-dos to consider. Those of you who are 40 years young, 50 years young, 60 years young, you can also consider these, but I specifically want to speak to our emerging level 5 generation. And these are for your consideration. The best students are those who never quite believe their professors. Number one, build a personal board of directors. People selected not for their accomplishment, but for their character. The people you would be embarrassed to come to if you're thinking, is this really the right thing to do? That you realize that even asking them would be embarrassing. I remember when the personal board idea occurred to me. I was 25 years old. I did not have a father who I learned anything from except bad habits. And I always resented the fact that my classmates in college could call their dad and ask for advice. And I thought, wow, that is just odd. And then I began to resent it. And then I finally realized, well, if I didn't have a father, I'll make one. I'll create one. So I started reading biographies. Figure if I didn't get a dad, I'll just invent one. And as reading those biographies, I was driving down Alma Street in Palo Alto one day, and I was listening to these interviews with the great President Harry Truman, done by Merle Miller, and there's this wonderful line where Harry Truman says, "If you don't know the difference between right and wrong by the time you're 30, you never will." And I pulled off the side of the road. I'm panting. I'm 25 years old. I've got 5 years to figure this out. And hence was born the idea of the personal board of directors. Your personal board does not always need to know they're on your personal board. Peter Drucker was on my personal board and never knew it. And he was not selected for that because, in my mind, he was the greatest management thinker, but simply because he was one of the greatest people. Number 2, please turn off your electronic gadgets. Not for others, but for yourself. Effective people take time to think. Begin the discipline of putting white space on your calendar where there's no phone, no email. I was going to say no fax, but they don't even have that anymore. No Twitter, no emails, no connections, and engage in this glorious pockets of quietude to think. Do you know that Rick Warren reads a book every single day? A book a day. A book a day, 365 days a year. You're at 1,000 books in 3 years. Number 3. This would be a great time in life to work on your 3 circles. And perhaps consider the idea of studying yourself like a bug, right? And of making empirical observations to say, what does this bug do? What is this bug passionate about? And what is this bug encoded for? And with no judgment. Don't judge and say, this bug should be better at math. Non-judgmental empirical observation of what you really are passionate about, genetically encoded for, and where you can be useful. And get input from those who love you, who know you, as empirical data on you. Number 4, what is your questions to statements ratio and can you double it? John Gardner, another member of my personal board, brought me into his office one day and said, "It occurs to me, Jim, you spend way too much of your time trying to be interesting. Why don't you channel your time around being interested?" That 10 seconds changed my life. Imagine going into every situation not with how to be interesting, but how to be interested, how to ask questions, how to learn from everybody you meet. What is your questions to statements ratio and can you double it? And number 5, for those who have dealt with health, this one also then really jumps out, and at some point all of us will. Add the question, a specific question, to live by. If you woke up tomorrow morning and discovered that you had inherited $20 million, and you also discovered you had a terminal disease and you only had 10 years to live, what would go on your stop doing list? Number 6, start your stop doing list. How many here have a to-do list? How many have a stop doing list? When we were talking last night, Rick Warren and I, and Peter Drucker had asked the same question always of him every time he came. Not what have you done, but what have you stopped doing? Because someone like Rick Warren doesn't exactly have a shortage of energy to do stuff. And the real task is to always be clear about what to not do, what to stop doing. Number 7, unplug the opportunities that distract you. Just because something's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity is a fact but not a reason. If it doesn't fit your 3 circles, remember there will always be many once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. Number 8, how do we build that legion of level 5 leaders? Find something for which you have so much passion that you are willing to endure the pain. Number 9, great time of life to articulate the values that you will not compromise. As a guiding constellation, remember this thing about the 18 and the 15 companies and what held them? Well, the same applies at an individual level. If we're going to go through whatever we're going to go through, what's the guiding constellation? It starts not first with our strategies, but with our values. And number 10, prepare to live a life where at age 65, you're 1/3 of the way through your work. So I would like to close in the last 5 minutes back with Peter. I mentioned earlier his concern and compassion for the individual. I was a very afraid individual in 1994. I was completely unknown. All I knew was that I didn't want to follow a traditional path. I wanted to carve my own path, and I was leaving the academic world, and I was really nervous about whether this could work. And I'd met a good friend of mine who knew Peter Drucker, and he said, "Who do you admire?" I mentioned Peter. He said, "Well, maybe Peter'd like to talk with you." I thought, Peter wouldn't want to talk with me. Why would he want to talk with me? And then one day I get this message on my message machine. "This is Peter Drucker. Call me." And I call him, and I'm calling from the Seattle airport, and I'm talking into the phone because there's people around, and I hear him yell through the phone, "Speak up, I'm not young anymore." So I'm yelling into the phone. Scheduled this day to come down. I will never forget the moment when he came to his door. He comes to the door, and he reaches out and grabs my hand with 2 of his. And he brings me across and he says, "Mr. Collins, I am so very pleased to meet you." He says that before I have a chance to say it is an honor to meet you. And we sit, as many in this room have sat, with him in the wicker chair, and you keep wanting to ask Peter Drucker questions, but you don't get a chance because he's asking you questions. And I remember how his brain worked. We went to lunch, and he had a double espresso and a glass of Merlot, preserve the core, stimulate progress. And he gave me great solace of realizing that, he stumbled as well. I remember describing the great frustration of writing and then having to write a whole chapter thinking it wasn't any good and throwing it in a wastebasket, and he would look at me and said, "That is immense progress." I remember that every time now I throw a whole chapter in the wastebasket. Progress. And he taught me the idea that day that entrepreneurship's not a business idea, it's a life idea. Right? You can do a paint-by-numbers kit to life, or you can try to paint a masterpiece on a blank canvas. At the end of that day, which was one of those, I still have all the notes, of course, but he said something that has come back to me over and over and over and over and over again. He's turned to me in that wonderfully challenging and loving way. And he said, "I can see that you are very worried about your survival. You'll probably survive." And you worry a lot at your age about how to be successful. That's all fine and good. You'll probably figure that out. But if you really want to make good on this day and this time, why don't you really think about how to be useful? And that's the level 5 question. I don't see myself, I see it as a journey, but that's the level 5 question. How do we be useful? And so, as I said earlier, I believe there are 2 ways to change the world. The sword, meaning action, and the pen. And which is why this idea of having Ito-san and Drucker on the same building is action action and pen. And when young people ask, what can I do to make a difference? I might suggest get your hands on an organization. If you can't find one, start one. Be like Wendy Kopp. And employ the disciplines of management which will amplify your leadership, applying everything you can learn from Drucker to lead it with disciplined impact to multiply your own personal impact by 1,000-fold. And therefore to be useful times 1,000-fold. And if there is any better way to honor the legacy of Peter Drucker, I cannot think of it. And he would smile not by saying he was a great man, which he was, but by going out and making ourselves useful. And so I leave you with that. Please go out and make yourselves useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for making yourself so useful to us on this very special day. And thank you for believing in free speech. When I called Jim and asked him to be the keynote speaker for the Drucker Centennial, he said, "Why me, Ira?" And I said, "Because you're the living Drucker, Jim." And he said, "No, I'm not." So I said, "Well, let me try a more compelling argument. Peter would want you to be the keynote speaker at his centennial." I'm going to embarrass him a little bit now, and I don't mean to be ungrateful, but it's genuine. We have this huge dilemma at Claremont Graduate University and at the Peter F. Drucker and Masatoshi Ito Graduate School of Management. Thanks to the generosity of some spectacular donors, we have the Peter F. Drucker Chair in Management as a liberal art, and it has not yet been filled. So, Jim, I want to remind you that when you're prepared to come down from the mountain and from Boulder, we would be deeply honored, as would Peter, to have you as our very first Peter F. Drucker Chair in Management as a liberal art. I mentioned that we're a small organization, and I don't have the gift that I know we've prepared for you, Jim, but I do want you to know that this wasn't entirely a free speech. In addition to some memorabilia of the school, we have a plaque which says, on behalf of all of us, and I get to sign it, we're making a $1,000 contribution in your name to a nonprofit of your choice as a gesture of thanks and appreciation for your being so useful to us today. Okay, we get to take a little break, 15 minutes. Then you've got to choose among 5 selections. I don't know how you're going to choose. They're all so tempting. Those sessions will go for an hour and 15 minutes. We'll then have a slightly abbreviated lunch. See you there.